Our continuing chronological study Bible study and venture into the whole Bible. We have started with Genesis, where we still are in Epoch 2. We're in the years 1500 to 2000 BC at this time, and we have finally, after we've skipped over a lot of, well, not a lot, but a couple of chapters of genealogy, and we can refer back to that, but we are in chapter 37 of Genesis. This begins the somewhat protracted story of Joseph. Joseph was one of Jacob's sons. Now, Jacob was one of the three what?
Patriarchs.
Patriarchs, that's right. They were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we are now in, he had many sons, of course Jacob did. And it says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is an account of Jacob's family line, it says, although it is, but that's not the focus of it. It's talking about Jacob's children, and it said, Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. So those were female names. And his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph. Israel is who?
Jacob.
Exactly. Because why?
Because he was one of his youngest sons.
And God renamed those people from time to time. So, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. In other words, he was a unexpected blessing. And so, Israel, Jacob, made, it says here, an ornate robe for him. What do we know that robe as?
Robe of many colors.
That's exactly right. And what country star had a famous song
Dolly
about that?
Parton.
That's right. Congratulations. That's right. Now we've got to the real interest. And the coat of many colors. But here's the problem. What has already happened in the Bible happens again. We've talked about this so many times. His brothers were jealous that their father loved him more than any of them. They hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, you know, today, I'm an only child. Some of you are only children. But today, you would never admit that you loved one of your children more than the other, even though you might. But back in those days, it was sort of a pecking order. And that wasn't unusual to be said. We've seen it several times already. And so he said they hated him and would not speak a kind word to him. And then we get right into it. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, and the eternal question is, why would he tell these dreams? If you've read them, why would he tell these to his brothers? Why didn't he just keep them to himself? But anyway, he told them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Now that's a way to make friends with your brother. I mean, that's something. And you're thinking, well, my question, of course, was, what was the purpose of this? And the reason I'm going to say that is, I'm sorry, I can't get stopped. The reason I asked that is we're going to continue to go along this theme. And how did it benefit Joseph? That's the question. How did it benefit him? So he said, his brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. I'm surprised at that. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. This is pretty vivid dream imagery. I mean, I have dreams. Sometimes they're just kind of, sometimes I wake up and, you have dreams of different kinds. Some people, theologians would say these were dreams that God put into his mind. Some of my dreams, I don't believe God had a thing to do with. Just saying. But, it could have been the other side of the coin. And he said, when he told his father, it wasn't good enough to tell his brothers. He went and told his father. Now, this is incomplete. Well, let me finish this. He said, when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? But his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Because his father, who was?
Israel.
Who used to say, I am the son, my father is the son of God. I mean, my father, yes, that's right. Yes. So there's this chain. Now, who is this a complete contrast to in the Bible? We're not going to come up. It's not going to be long until we get there. This is a complete contrast to who? David.
Oh yeah.
Remember that when David was chosen to be king of Israel, he was a young man, young boy, and he was out in his field. He was out in the fields with the sheep. And remember, God's appointed person came to David's father and said, gather all your sons, for I need to choose a king of Israel. Remember all of that? Mm-hmm. And he didn't even bother to get David out of the field. He was too young and he was too inconsequential. Recall that?
Yeah.
And then the person, wasn't it, who was it, Zechariah or something, said, is this all the children you have? Remember? And they said, well, I have one more. We'll go get it. And then he chose it. Then David went on to slay Goliath. And then he went on to do all the things that we know about. But this was a person, David, who had nothing to say, really, about any of it. And yet, here is Joseph, who had a lot to say. What do you think was the difference in the two? It struck me as I thought about this and read about it. You haven't had a chance to. But what would you think is the difference between the way David handled it and the way Joseph is handled it?
David was humble, yeah.
He was, but why?
Well, because a prophet had come to David and told them, and Joseph just had the dream himself.
Maybe. Could be. Any other reasons? Let's think about it. This is what came to my mind. This is the way I think about it. Joseph was treated poorly, as we're going to study. Thrown in a cistern, a well. He was sold for 20 shekels. We're going to talk about all that. But yet, and he was thrown in prison. All of these things. But yet, he was always favored. Even in prison, remember, he was favored. We're going to talk about that. David had this life of, he had great ups. But then David had Bathsheba. He killed Uriah, her husband. He did all sorts of things that were not good. And I just wonder to myself and to you now, if David had this foreknowledge, foretaste, that his life was going to be questionable. David had people come after him to kill him. His life was going to, he maybe didn't know exactly what was going to happen, I don't think. But he was not going to live this pure life. Now, Joseph lived a pure life. He had bad things happen to him, but not of his own doing. Except maybe this bragging about the sheaves and the bow down part. But he always was moving, even when he was put down, God was looking after him and lifted him up. David went through a lot of horrible things that he did of his own. So maybe David thought, I should be quiet because I'm a mess. I'll have to write a lot of songs to get over this. As opposed to Joseph, who said, my story's going to be good. Just saying, just a way to think about it. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying you might compare the two. So it goes on to say, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel, Jacob, said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he said. Now, why would his father send him to them when his father knows they hate him? Why would he do that? Away from his protection. Why would he do that? I don't know. But he did.
Just assuming they were his sons and he didn't really think they would do anything to him.
Yeah.
I guess how many fathers really don't know what their children would do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not a father. So. He said, so it goes on to say, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, what are you looking for? My brothers, they're not here. They've gone to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him, it says, in the distance, and before he reached him, they plotted to kill him. Remember, these are plains. They can see people. That's why they did it, because they could protect themselves. That's why they chose these lands, is so that they could protect themselves. They saw him coming. And they said, this is it. Dad's not here. We're getting rid of him. So here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben is a brother of Joseph's, one of the older brothers, and a brother of these men, heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. He had a plan. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him. It wasn't bad enough that he went out to see him. He kept wearing this robe. I'm sure he had other robes. He wears this robe. Let's just twist that knife blade in there, so to speak. And he didn't know the other knife blade was coming. And so they took him and threw him into the cistern, which was empty and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat their meal and looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. Remember, we started out early hearing about the Ishmaelites who said they would take over this whole land, remember? And what did Ishmaelites, what are they famous for? Forming of cities.
Oh, that's right.
They're the ones who formed cities and towns and the government that we even to this day sort of follow. So he said, he saw the Ishmaelites, and they said their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Wasn't that gracious now? His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his father's brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver. That is about 8 ounces or 230 grams of silver to Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He rent his clothes. We hear this in the Bible often. That was a sign of anguish. They rent their clothes. They rent Jesus' clothes on the cross, remember? And he said, the boy isn't here. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. Not our brother's robe. The words are important, by the way. This is not our brother's robe. This is your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. And they all sat there and kind of went, And so then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to who? Potiphar, of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now it starts to get interesting even more. We're going to get now to another sex story. Because we've had lots of them. Because Potiphar had what? A wife. And Joseph must have been pretty good looking even without that robe. So at the time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite woman named Shua. He married her, made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived it. So it goes on with some of this. And then it says, Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and named her Tamar. Who is a famous person, infamous person named Tamar that we've heard in our lifetime? One of the Boston Marathon bombers.
Oh.
And so, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, a man, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as her brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. So this was a trend, a way they did it. The brother died, other brother stepped in, made love to the wife, and raised children in the name of the brother through the brother's widow. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, well, he didn't complete the act. I'm not going to go into this probably this is where you wish we were reading out of the King James and we just said all this. But to keep from providing offspring for his brother. Now this becomes important later, if you've read ahead. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight because he didn't follow what he was told, which was interesting. He didn't follow what he was told, which was to sleep with his brother's wife, his brother's widow. But he was wicked in the sight of the Lord. Hard to keep up with all of that. And so the Lord put him to death also. God's been busy putting people to death willy-nilly. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. He may die too, just like his brother. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep. Here comes another tricky woman, I'm telling you. She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to this town, Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that was his daughter-in-law. What? This is a little of a stretch here, isn't it? I mean, but well, whatever. It is what it is. He went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. So now we've got Judah hiring a prostitute. Oh. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. He still doesn't know who she is. And he says, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. Because, after all, that would help her and keep her alive, and, you know. And he said that, she said, will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? Send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? Your seal and its cord, and the staff in your hand. She answered. So he gave them to her. She must have been pretty. but she had a veil on her. He came to her, and he slept with her, and she became pregnant. And they just became pregnant left and right, didn't they? And she became pregnant. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judas sent the goat by his friend, the Adamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. She had gone. He asked the men who lived there, "Where's the shrine prostitute?" There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her." Besides, the men who lived there said there hadn't been any prostitute. Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock." The "we" was sort of a royal we, I'm assuming. "After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and put her to death." Boy, they are quick, aren't they? As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these." Now, Tamar was pretty smart. "I am pregnant by the man who owns them," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again." He doesn't tell what he did. He just tells this other side story. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But he drew back his hand. His brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, and who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. And Perez in that time stood for what? It stood for the word first. Perez. So that's why he was named. He came out first. Now we get to chapter 39. Oh, this has moved fast. Now Joseph has been taken down to Egypt. We get back to Joseph. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had him taken there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time, now this is only the first time this happens, by the way. So he says, from the time he put him in charge, all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and the field. So Potiphar left everything he had into Joseph's care. He was his manager. He was his home manager. So Potiphar left. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So he narrowed it down. Now, forward is what I've mentioned many times. Later in England, all of these rich earls and dukes and people had hired estate managers who looked after everything and then met with them to report to them. No different than having a manager and assistant managers in a business. It's no different. It's an owner and managers. It's no different. Not unusual. And so then it goes on to say, what this is really telling us is what? Potiphar, because of Joseph's success, because of Potiphar's now increasing wealth, he's what? He's not watching his business. He's only interested in what he wants to eat, basically what concerns him. He's not watching his house. He's not watching his fields. He's just waiting for the reports. They're all good. So what happens? Joseph was a well-built and handsome man, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, "My master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Good for Joseph.
Yeah.
He did. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. He should have turned around and left. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left hurriedly, it doesn't say, but you can imagine he ran out, and when he did, his cloak that she had stayed in her hands and came off of him. Now she had evidence. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hands, she ran out and had run out of the house. She called her household servants. "Look," she said to him, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. Nothing like a woman scorned, remember the saying. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. The Hebrew slave you brought us came in to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how the slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Now that's important to know that. The place where the king's prisoners were held. He wasn't just held anywhere. He took him to where the king's prisoners were held. Now the king is another word for what?
Pharaoh.
Exactly. So what does this do? What does putting him there do?
Was in a position to.
He puts him in a position where the jailers and the people that we'll hear about later have their watch over him and will report to who directly?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. So even now, God is watching out for Joseph. So he's even now watching out for Joseph. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those he held in prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything that Joseph cared. Again, he paid no attention. And because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Wow. So, we're getting to chapter 40 now, the cupbearer and the baker. And Pharaoh was angered with these two officials, chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was found. The captain of the guard assigned him to Joseph, and he attended him. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the men who were being held in prison had dreams the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw them rejected, so he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they said, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? What about our dreams? Do our dreams belong to God? The good ones and the bad ones?"
Guess so. I don't remember any of them.
But they're placed in your mind.
Yeah.
A lot of times, healthcare professionals tell you that what you're doing, mental health professionals say, when you dream, you're working out problems and things of your life that you don't work out during the day. Your mind works them out while you're asleep. Interesting. And so then he says, then they each tell their dreams. "In my dream, I saw a vine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into his cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of Hebrews. Even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in the dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. In my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top baskets were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh. This is what it means. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off the basket of your head and pile your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh." Oh. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in his interpretation, on a post. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. No good deed goes unpunished. Now, Pharaoh has a dream. We're now to 41. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Here Joseph is in prison after this, but he has these dreams. Pharaoh has these dreams. He was standing by the Nile. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. The cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fair cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. That was a nightmare, so to speak. He fell asleep again in his second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a stalk. After them, several other grains and heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched. The thin weeds of grain swallowed up the healthy ones. Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, he sent for all his wise men and magicians and told them his dreams, and no one could interpret them. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, now he remembers. Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants and he imprisoned me in the chief baker. And he goes on to talk about the dreams and talks about Pharaoh. He talks about Joseph interpreting his dreams correctly. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. I had a dream no one can interpret. And then he said, but I hear you can interpret dreams. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, so here's the important part there. What did I just say? I went over it too fast. I cannot do it. Let me phrase it differently. I cannot do it, but God can interpret your dreams. He said that before. I cannot do it. It is not me. It is not within my power. It is within the power of God to do these things. Good choice of words. And so then he said, God will give Pharaoh the answer. In my dream I was standing, and he tells the dreams again. And then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has fulfilled to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. 7 lean, ugly cows came upward after 7 years. This is what? This is saying, this is what made Joseph sort of famous. This is where he got his power. God let him interpret these dreams, or gave him the interpretation. He said, you're going to have 7 good years. Then you're going to have 7 famine years. And what do you need to do during those years?
Store up your grain.
Exactly. So God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. So then Pharaoh has now let Pharaoh look for discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint a commissioner over the land. This is Joseph telling him to do all of this. And he says they should collect all of the food of these good years, and he tells him what to do. Plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials, so says, can we find anyone like this man? One in whom this is the Spirit of God? Can you imagine Pharaoh's looking around, is there anybody here that can do all of this? You know? And he said, and then he says, you shall be, so then, since God has made all this known to you, Joseph, there's no one so discerning and wise as you should be in charge of my palace, and all my people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command. And people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift a hand or foot in all of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name of Zephnetha-Paneah, and gave him Sintha, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. I don't know why the names are sort of the same. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And during the 7 years of abundance, Joseph collected all the food produced in those and stored them. Each city he put food in there grown in the fields surrounding it. So he gave each city their own grain that they had raised, instead of taking it all to Pharaoh. Smart. And then Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sands of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. And Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh. And he said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my household, my father's household." The second he named Ephraim. That name will come back to us, Ephraim. And said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Second, the 7 years of abundance came to an end. As just Joseph had said, there was famine in all other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. It varied throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe and everywhere. Wow. So God was faithful to Joseph. Joseph never had to do what David had to do, and that is, go to God and cry. You've never read here, we've not heard me say today that Joseph went to God and said, "God, why are you letting this happen to me? God of my father, why are you letting this happen to me?" But David had to do that. Remember, he was so grieved over killing Uriah that he went and stayed by himself. There's a big difference in how we deal with God, I think, is what we're hearing here. Some people are saying, "God, why did you let this happen?" And others, with faith, are saying, "God will take care of me." Right now, and I'll talk about it later, but just briefly because we have just a little time. Right now, if you're reading all the news accounts and you're doing all the things, right now in Uvalde, where I was this week, people are saying, "Why would God let this happen?" And that's not just in Uvalde, that happens everywhere. As a funeral director for 48 years, I can't tell you how many people have said when they've lost a young person or somebody to tragedy or a husband or wife or whatever, someone that is not old and, they'll say, "Why would God let this happen?" It's the question, always the question, why would God let this happen? And the people of Uvalde have now turned against one another because of that situation with the police. The police should have done this. These people are mad about it, and other people defend the police and say, "Well, they did." But yet, people are saying, "Why would God let this happen? Why would God, allow this?" And it is a very, not only broken, but it has a very terrible vibe there in what's going on in that town. I can tell you I was there. And people are more than just a little broken. Different than anything else I've ever seen. So I want you to keep in mind this story of Joseph and the difference between David when we get to David. Because Joseph never blamed God for what happened. And he never cried out to God to make it right. He never did. Whereas David wrote 150 Psalms. He went to live by himself without Bathsheba because of what he did to Uriah. Uriah was Bathsheba's husband, who he had killed on the front lines of battle, so it seemed like it was battle. Not only did he have him killed, he had a story made up to lie about it. These are two Old Testament people, not far apart, by the way, who are very different in how they approached their faith. Now, this was again before, remember, this was again before there were rabbis, before there were ministers, before there were anything like that. These people had a faith directly through God. That's why Jacob and those people would always say, "You, the God of my father, the God of my father, the God of my father." David didn't say that. He spoke directly to God. It will be very obvious to all of us, I believe, when we get to the story of David and all of his life. And of course, David turns out to be what? The greatest. David turns out to be, what does it say, when Jesus was born? Yes, and it says after Jesus, born of the house of David. He was given credit, born of the house of David. But they are two different approaches. Now, my question to you is, before we stop, we just have 5 minutes. My question to you is one better than the other? Is one a better way to approach God and to live your life? Is it better to not call on God and never blame God for what happens to you? Or is it better to, and David didn't blame God, he called out to God, cried out to God. God, look at this mess I'm in. Help me, save me, take me out of this mess. I killed one of my own people so I could have his wife, and other things he did. And interestingly enough, remember that this happened after David had killed Goliath, which was no small feat. David took a stone, put it in a sling, and killed a giant. That's pretty, you just don't get up and do that without practice. So that God was with David always. But David cries out to God, I have failed you, I have done this. Joseph never failed God. Joseph led the right life. He never failed God. And so therefore Joseph didn't call out to God. Joseph did ask the baker to help him.
But he always had the faith.
He always had the faith. And he always went with what he thought was God's will. Now, it is very different for you and I to think that God's will would be that we would go to prison for 20 years, or that God's will would be that we would be thrown in a well, a dry well. That would be very difficult for you and I to think that. But we have our own challenges. Right now in Uvalde and in other towns before there, Southern and all these places, they all have had to have that same question. Why us? Why here? I read yesterday, and I had people tell me, this is such a nice little town. We can't imagine where this would happen. Yeah. So how do you move forward from that? That's what they'll all struggle with the rest of their lives. They'll struggle. How do you move forward with that? Joseph didn't struggle to move forward. He made the best of every situation. And because he made the best of every situation, God favored him. It said it several times. He was favored by God. On the other hand, David made the best of every situation, but he also made the best of bad situations.
He caused them all.
He caused them.
his
That's right.
But he was tempted every time.
That's the difference. He was tested. That's the difference in the two people. David caused problems. Joseph was the victim of problems. And God was faithful to them both, but Joseph was favored. David was favored, but later. So what I like about David's story when we come to it is that much like ours, David had highs and lows and highs. And God was with him through all of it, but he gave him, what do we call it? Free will. Sometimes David did the right thing. Sometimes David did the wrong thing. But God was still with him. Joseph did the right thing, except the early part we talked about, where Joseph went and shared his dreams with his brother and his father. Did he create his own problems by doing that?
Or did he have to do that to set up the scenario so God could use him?
Or maybe his own destiny. Because he created his own destiny.
Yeah.
Did God create his destiny
Yes.
by having him set that up?
Yeah.
That's a very strong point. God works in mysterious ways, we've always said. And God works in our lives, and when we think God is not in our lives and with us, He is. It's what we do with it.
Well, if Penny were here, she would say,
It's the plan.
it's all part of his plan.
That's right. Well, she would say that, yes, once I reminded her to say that.
Yes.
But you're right. But how much, so here's the question. Think about, what part of the plan is you following for God?
Don't know yet.
And we may never know, but there is a.
What if the plan is the devil has his way,
Yes, that's,
and then God redeems it?
yeah.
That's what you have to think about.
Yeah.
Sometimes the devil had his way with Joseph and his brothers.
Yes.
God didn't cause Joseph to be placed somewhere, to be put in prison. He didn't do any of that. That was Satan working through his brothers. Separate him from God, because what does sin do? Separates us from God. That's what happened. When King David had his Bathsheba, that was what? That wasn't God. God he just had his hand off the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And David went the wrong way because of who? Satan. But then God redeemed it. And that's what always happens. God redeems it. And that's what we have to think about in our lives. We think about these two great people in the Bible who approach God in different ways. We have to say, when we have our own choices to make, sometimes Satan is the winner in those choices. But sometimes, but always, God redeems us in those choices. If we have faith.
Mm-hmm.
If we have faith. Some people don't have faith. And that's what happens. People who don't have faith go with Satan. And the people who have faith, God redeems. And that's the story of our lives. And that's the story of this book. The scarlet thread of redemption.